Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. If you would please take your seats, we'd like to begin the program. So if you would please come on in and make yourselves at home. Hello, I'm Deborah Roberts with ABC News, and I am delighted to be here with you today. Yeah, come on in, come on in. We're a friendly crowd here. Welcome to all of you, and congratulations, by the way, to one. You're 20 years old, not such a baby anymore. I was reading that 20 years, at least in marriages, is platinum, which symbolizes the strength of a marriage. So I'm going to also assume it symbolizes the strength of this organization. This anniversary is such a big one because it is a great time for you to be able to share and talk about the incredible impact with the historic implications for humanity that this organization champions. We want to welcome all of you as the village that has helped achieve this impact. And on behalf of the organization, I want to say thank you. Now, we know that the IQ levels in this room are off the charts, that's the word on the street, and we want you to use them to help us grapple with some of the greatest challenges that we have ahead of us, enabling economic opportunities and healthy lives for everybody. And on a personal note, I want to thank my friend Hillary Gumbel, who made me aware of this organization. She told me about it at lunch one day. She was involved with this group called ONE, and I said, yeah, what does ONE stand for? She said, ONE. I said, yeah, but what does ONE stand for? One. And you can imagine what on and on. Oh, I get it. One. We are all one. The original idea of ONE was to bring people together to make big bets of big ideas to end extreme poverty and preventable disease. I can't think of anything more important and more crucial than that. While we have not yet solved these big issues, ONE and the partners have continued to make progress. And 20 years later, you continue to make your way closer to that goal. In fact, we're tracking it very closely, which you're going to hear more about later today from some of the panelists. This progress is thanks to all of you and to the millions of people all around the world who have collectively taken more than 25 million actions, big and small, like signing petitions, taking in-person meetings with their elected officials, or just writing postcards to decision makers. ONE has helped advocate for an additional $1 trillion, that's with a T, $1 trillion in development finance. That's right. The delta between finance for these issues in 2004 and what it is today adds up to 20 years to $1 trillion. And if those dollars, just imagine this, if those dollars were single dollar bills, I'm told that they would make it to a third of the way to the moon. That's how much of an impact it has. But much more important is the impact that they are continuing to have. 59 million people have had their lives spared because of people receiving life-saving antiretrovirals or treatments for malaria or tuberculosis. 1 billion children's lives have been protected by a vaccine, thanks to ONE. And those people who went on to receive an education or start a business upon the electricity that ONE's campaign is helping to roll out. Now, we are in some very, very difficult times, and you may not know it by looking at the headlines, but 2023 was the best year yet for humanity. And despite all the chaos around us, and we are impatient optimists, but we do believe that we can make things a little bit better. But there are lots of challenges ahead. I don't have to tell you that. The world has changed, and of course, we all have to change with it. So let's get to it, shall we? Joining us now to discuss ONE's first 20 years and its next are two of the people who are continuing with big ideas, and they have the courage to make big bets. Jamie Drummond, just perfectly timed here. Turn of the century idea to drop the debt led the cancellation of $110 billion of debt for some of the world's poorest countries. As a co-founder of Data and then ONE, he is the architect of ONE's secret sauce, you might say, for global social change. The tough-to-beat combination of smart and savvy policy, pop culture, and pragmatism. Through his work, with One and as founder of Sharing Strategies, Jamie has played a significant role in the development and launch of many successful global health, anti-poverty, and anti-corruption campaigns. The One campaign believes in the power of a story, and there's one particular story, by the way, with Ndidi Okonkwo Winelli. How did I do with that? As the first African president and CEO of One, Ndidi is determined to shift the way the world talks about Africa, changing the face of Africa from that of a hungry child to that of a powerful female entrepreneur. And you just have to look at her and you see it right there. She knows a little bit about that. As it happens, Ndidi, her own entrepreneurial career started at the ripe age of 12, selling avocados at the market in her hometown in Nigeria. With her mother's encouragement, she set her sights on business, attending both Penn's Wharton School and Harvard Business School. She took what she learned back home to her continent and started Leap Africa to empower the next generation of African leaders. And then African Food Changemakers, which provides support for African entrepreneurs to start and scale resilient and sustainable agribusinesses. No surprise with her charisma. I met her earlier today. With her husband, she is the co-founder of Sahel Consulting and Ace Foods. So together, Ndidi and Jamie have valuable insights on One's past and its future. So would you please welcome to the stage Ndidi and Jamie.
So what's going on?
This is such a special afternoon, and thank you for being such a wonderful, brilliant hostess, and you look gorgeous in your Nigerian fashion. Please give her a round of applause. We have to give her flowers, one of the best and brightest from America to the world. We honor you. Thank you for making the afternoon, making time in a very busy Onga schedule to spend this afternoon with us. Some of you have come from far and wide, and we see many friends of One, supporters of One, and leaders in the room. I want to give a shout out to our board chair, Tom Preston. Please give him a round of applause, sitting right in front. African culture, we have to recognize our elders and those who do good work on our behalf. And there are many founders and friends in the audience as well, so thank you. Now, it's an honor to have this conversation with Jamie Drummond. Jamie is one of the most spectacular people I've had the opportunity to meet. And I first met him through the World Economic Forum, where we're both young global leaders, maybe 25 years ago, a really long time ago. Jamie, I have a series of questions for you.
How exciting.
20th anniversary. We have to go back to the past to think about the future. And today we're launching the Trillions Tracker, which shows the enormous scale of the financing challenge for people and planet. We need $2.5 trillion in public financing a year. But the data shows that in the last few years, we've not closed that gap. In fact, we're still at a very, very dismal level, 29% at a time of populism, turbulent politics, and lots of distractions. How have we done it? And what do you think that tells us about activism and the world we live in today?
Well, first of all, Ndidi, thank you for everything, and all the people in this room. And it's humiliatingly embarrassing for the credit I get on these occasions. I was an activist at the right time in the right place, just before the millennium, and we made the most of that moment. Hallelujah, we did. We got some debt cancelled. We got some momentum going. But it was certainly not just me. It was a whole army movement of people all around the world, and I was a little teeny tiny part of it. And I was inspired by all those people, and that's just what keeps us going. And it's the people in this room, and it's actually, I find this very moving, this whole thing. And I'm very excited to be here, but I'm excited to tell the story about all the people who got us here, and even more excited to meet the people we are today and where we're going together. And it's all the different organizations. One is about all of its partners, as much as it is the group of people at the team. And it's so embarrassing for me when I get credit and Lucy's in the room, Lucy Matthew over there, or Tom. You know, there's like all these activists who've been marching on this, and all the campaigners that inspired us, like Zaki in South Africa, and Zia Gario, and the anti-corruption campaigners who kept us going. Today, a lot of it recently has been deft inside work. it is hard to win the public argument. Nativist populism is well organized, it is well funded, it is winning, it is setting the narrative, and we are not. It's a forest fire, and we're fighting it with little wooden spoons a lot of the time. And that's why we need to get organized much better than we have been. All of us, all together, you know, from the philanthropies to the think tanks to our activists on the inside in government, to our friends in the media. But yes, the one team with our partners like Global Citizen and other organizations helped get a major issue of SDRs, helped get them recycled. There's still a lot of way for that money to turn up. There was the debt suspension initiative during COVID, which was something. Much more needs to be done. And, you know, so there has been some progress, a lot more financing from within countries recently. So, you know, you can look at reasons that show activism and advocacy and the smart inside organizing backed up by voices on the street does still get policy change. And I heard Ken Stanley Robinson, you know, the future science fiction writer the other day, describe the difficulty of trying to make progress happen in the madness of our moment today. You know, it's like being on a penny farthing, on a tightrope, and with a pole, you know, those sort of old circus acts where the guy's on the penny farthing on the tightrope. And on the pole, there are lunatics on both sides jumping up and down on the pole. But what can you do? You just try and stay on the tightrope and navigate and manage. And we're managing. And right now, sometimes in the thickness and hardness of the storm, to stay afloat, you know, keep your sails trimmed and eyes on the horizon, and keep moving forward, and don't let them get you down. And I just think that's what's brilliant about what you're doing now at One and DD. You've kept this organization focused. You've kept it moving forward with Tom's support and leadership and all the team. And it's just wonderful to be on this stage up here with you.
Thank you, Jamie. So last night, Jamie told us that he called Bono twice a week for 2 years. Jamie, I mean, that's persistence. Who has ever done that, even for someone you're interested in getting to know? But you've worked with world leaders like Bono, celebrities, grassroots movements. Can you share a crazy behind-the-scenes story?
So David Barry got back quicker than Bono. Muhammad Ali got back quicker than Bono. Tom York got back quicker than Bono. But he was busy. He was on a world tour at the time. But the difference is that when he called back, instead of saying, I'll sign a petition, he said, there's a financial crisis in Southeast Asia. Surely this means your proposal for debt cancellation isn't going to happen. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. This is not your average, you know, global rock star. He's interested in counter-cyclical measures of a Keynesian kind. I mean, who is this character? We could go far with this guy. This is not your usual run-of-the-mill celebrity influencer. But in terms of why I kept on persisting, because I'm persistent. And anyone who's an activist who isn't persistent is not an activist, is not a campaigner. You've got to keep trying, and you must never accept defeat.
I love that. Please, how many activists in the room? I want to be like Jamie Drummond when I grew up.
You certainly are.
You cannot accept defeat. If you don't tweet anything from this moment, please, that's a tweetable quote. Now, as we think about the core of One's model, which you helped invent, there's been the intersection of policy, pop culture, and politics, bringing people together who disagree. And now, more than ever before, we have people on both sides of many aisles in many countries that we work in who disagree. How has this model of change evolved, and what will it take to bring us closer together around issues of justice and equity?
I mean, that could be a very long answer, but I would say that we're not going to get far if we don't better manage social media. It is, unfortunately, there are business models which make money from hate and division and are driving us apart. And that's got to be done. It's not necessarily one's job, but I hope good people are on that, and they need help. In terms of, it's the conversation, and it's actually talking to people. I think a lot of us had hope in the early days of social media and digital organizing that it would make our jobs easier. We just start winning faster and faster. And it turns out the other side are better at it than we are, because they kind of fire up the adrenal glands and cortisol in a way that inspiring visions of justice and progress. We want that to work, but the the chance it gives for the other to be villainized is it's quite sobering. But when you actually meet the people, not with faceless names online, but the actual human beings in their village or community, they're okay. You can have a conversation with them. And once they've expressed their anger and the thing that's driving them and fueling it, you can start to make progress. And I think because we've got all online and digital with our activism and we've stopped being humans talking to each other in the coffee shop and the church in the basement. And that's what organizing, we need to do some old-fashioned organizing, basically, indeed. And we need support to do it. We used to stand on the shoulders of giants in the progressive faith movement, in labor, and in the entertainment industry. And that's how a lot of the progress was done. We had this movement based out of the anti-apartheid campaign that kept on going. It was an inspiring thing to be part of. And we had moral giants like Tutu and Madiba who kind of cast this light over all of us and gave us the encouragement to keep moving forward. We need to find that in each other every day through conversation and talking through the challenges. We need to get good at that again. And I'm sure that we can and we will, and we're going to start winning again the more we do that.
Thank you. One last question, because I know time is going. So in this building at the Rockefeller Foundation, we like to talk about big bets. And Raj just wrote a book about big bets, and I know you're a big thinker. And every single day, Jamie is sending a new message, a new idea, and a new thought. What are the big bets of our time, and how can we make it happen?
Two quick thoughts. One is, well, obviously it's Africa driving its story, but yeah, that's what you're here for, and passing the mic. But I think I was blown away. I was in that corner of the room last Sunday listening to Dr. Mona, who's done the cash transfers for mothers, young mothers who live in extreme poverty in Michigan, and in Flint, Michigan, and the extraordinary outcomes in terms of fighting poverty and promoting healthcare that has delivered. That might go across the country as a policy in this country, and that might go global, properly at scale, would actually achieve so many of the things we're talking about, the application of innovation, grassroots organizing, digital, and cash. That's a good example. But above all, it's like Sean from Budget, who's in the house somewhere. There you are. It's characters like this who keep government accountable, follow the money all the way through from resources to results, and make sure that the grand promises actually get results. It's getting behind that organizing, which is what's so great about the Ubuntu circles that you've come up with. That kind of organizing is what gives me hope, and that's, I think, what's going to get us forward. But indeed,
fantastic. Let me ask those who are standing. Please come. There are some chairs here. Huh? So we don't need you to stand in the back of the room. Go ahead.
Can I ask you a few questions?
Yes, please.
So what are you doing here? Why did you join this funny group? It wasn't just Tom Freston's charms. Like what?
That was a big part of it. But I would say that as an African, I have gotten really frustrated about this image of Africa as a hungry child and the face of poverty as a female farmer from Africa. And as someone who was working on the ground in the trenches for the last 20 years in Nigeria and across Africa, I felt that I needed to take a lot of the great work that many people in this room are doing and elevate it to the global stage so we can start changing those narratives. And that we need to fight and build bridges with our friends in the rest of the world to really shift power back to Africans, elevate African voices, and take agency for our future. And under my leadership, my hope is that we ensure that we're demanding for what Africa wants, not what the world thinks we need. And that's why I'm here.
Amen. And where do you want to take us exactly? Like 20 years' time? So next year, one will be 21, so it can have a drink in America. What's that about? But yeah, 20 years' time. Where will we be then?
So we've scoped out our vision, and we actually have a new vision statement at one, which says that our vision is that Africa will be recognized as an equal player in the global economic landscape. It's been UNGA week, right? And many of you have heard of the different dialogues that are happening about the future. And 20 years from now, I want to be here at UNGA, or maybe have UNGA shifted to Nairobi or in Johannesburg. We don't have to come to New York, right? And we love New York, but New York doesn't have to be the center of some of these discussions, because we would have shifted Wall Street to, Main Street and Broad Streets in Lagos. How about that? And the vision really is that when we think about our continent, we understand the complexity, but also that we are celebrating countries that have graduated from ODA. And my first weeks of being in Washington, it was the spring meetings, and everybody was talking about Korea as an example of a country that used to benefit from ODA that was now a contributor. And I said 20 years from now, we're not just going to be talking about Korea, we're going to be saying South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, Malawi, Zambia have graduated and are contributing, and that we would have sorted out many of the world's problems and worked ourselves out of a job. Jamie, if you and I are on this stage 20 years from now, we have failed.
No,
That's one of my
you will
goals.
be being thanked, and I will be in a pub in the west of Ireland.
Here, we just need to be celebrating the innovations that have come from our continent to the world. And that's really what will give me the biggest pride. And I'm in legacy mode, and I look around the room, and I know many of you have worked so hard fighting for the same causes, and we will see in our lifetime progress on many of these issues. So don't relent. Keep fighting.
Amen. Absolutely, 100%. I think wait.
So thank you, guys. We're going to pass the phone back to brilliant Deborah. Please give her a round of applause.
Woo. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys did very well. I thought I was going to have to come and clock you, but you did all right.
0, 0, 0.
You did very well, very, very well. And thank you for those messages of hope. And because at the end of the day, that's what we are all about, hope. It's hard to go anywhere these days without hearing a conversation about sustainability. And over the last 20 years, there have been great strides in advancing sustainable growth and prosperity across the African continent. But with mounting crises and shifting geopolitics, the world is falling farther behind as the consequences mount. As a result, there is substantial underinvestment in policies and programs to protect people and the planet. I think we all have heard this argument so much. We can close the financing gap, but it requires innovative ideas and ambition that go beyond business as usual. So this next panel is going to help us think about that. First, Sarah Maka, Executive Director of Africa for One, who will speak to their advocacy and partnership with other nations and multilateral institutions, highlighting what the innovative African-led financing solutions are that are already in place. Alexia Latortu, Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development at the U.S. Department of Treasury, who will speak to the U.S. government's role in supporting these efforts. And I'd also like to introduce Ms. Ahuna Ezi-Unkongwa, who will moderate the next panel. Ms. Ahuna is the Assistant Secretary General and Director of UNDP Africa Bureau at the United Nations. Day in and day out, Ms. Ahuna looks to answer the question of why Africa and why now through her work at the UN with Global Innovation Center. So would you please welcome Ms. Ahuna, Sarah Maka, and Alexia Latortu to the stage.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. When Ndidi calls, you have to answer. And actually, Ndidi, I want to start with your story. Not that I can tell your story, but I think when I think of you and the first time I met you and the passion and drive that you had already in your young years to be an influencer, I feel inspired. And when I see you in this position at One, I say to myself, this is the story that actually captures everything we want to say in this room today, is that success story of putting Africa at the center of a narrative that starts to shift minds about this continent. A place that I come from myself, where I was born, bred, educated, and what I think I find deeply disturbing is the negative narrative about this continent, about our systems, the system that produced me, and I came to this country and was able to compete with a Nigerian education in an Ivy League school. But when you listen to the negative narrative about our schools or our professors, you wonder, you really do wonder. Today I heard someone say that it is Africa's moment. This is the moment where Africa is not just going into the world, the world is coming into Africa. And why? For good reasons. This is a place that harbors perhaps the ingredients that the world needs for its survival in the next few decades. Whether it's in terms of human capital, look at the demographics, they speak for themselves, or in terms of the minerals that will power a net zero world, or in terms of the cultural integrity that will continue to keep us authentic, honest, and real. You're going to find it in Africa. And so the world moves into this continent. But do Africans everywhere realize this? Do we place the right value on what Africa has to offer? Or do we continue to treat this region as a place that is a dumping ground for handouts? So the error is here for Africa to be seen differently. Africans are not asking for a handout. They are asking for a handshake. And this is what defines partnership with Africa today. How do we put Africa at the center? Why should we have to make an effort to put Africa at the center? Africa is at the center. Like it or not. It's just a matter of confidence. I love this country, America, for one thing. You know, I did my graduate education here. And I remember one of our career counselors saying to me after she read my CV, which was ultra understated, because my culture asked me not to beat my own drums. And she said, Ahuna, if you want to succeed in this country, listen very carefully. If you have something to say it with passion. If you have nothing to say it with passion. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have two, I think, quite distinguished panelists for our conversation this afternoon. Sarah Maka, already introduced to you, Executive Director of Africa at One. And Sarah, you know, when I was reading about you, I think one thing that struck me is not that you've been, you know, one of a few who have made it through in your journey, but your passion to build an impactful and authentic presence across Africa in the things that you've done. But also I read about this idea that one is trying to bend the world towards justice and to change this idea that when you work with the people, you are taking away their agency when you are a development person. And you are trying to say you have to reinforce agency. So I want you to speak to us a little bit about that. How does one play this in this landscape through your advocacy and other work to generate the kind of agency that will create the confidence that Africa needs to claim its place at the center?
Thank you, Ahuna, for that very rousing introduction. And thank you all for being here. It's really special for us. You know, Africa's agency was birthed in prominence at one after we took a look at the context in which we're in. We realized that, in effect, Africa has reached an age where it's asking for more space, whether it's in the UN Security Council, whether it's in its uniform voice during COVID. There's a yearning for more space in the geopolitical platforms that Africa is requesting and demanding in many ways. So what we decided at one was Africa Agency is going to be really important. And the way we make that possible is what we do, how we do it, and where we do it. So what we do is we ensure that we are advocating for issues that are important to Africa. Because gone are the days when we develop policies for Africa outside of Africa and superimpose and say, this is good for Africa. Those days are gone. What we want to generate is, what are African citizens, policymakers, civil society organizations, what are they saying they need, and how can we amplify that and drive that in places where the power is, and in many circumstances, the power is still not in Africa. So we have to be very critically clear that it's in the G20, the G7s of the world that can determine those rules of engagement. And so if we want to change the rules of engagement for the continent, we have to go to those platforms. So what we do then is work on global financial architecture, because that's an issue Africa has been speaking a lot about. Credit rating agencies determine the perception of risk, and when that risk isn't priced accurately, what happens is we take loans from the capital market that generations have to pay back because they're at such high marks, and we are now carrying this burden based on unfair assumption of risk. So global financial architecture is big. SDR recycling is an issue that we're working on. It's quite technical, but it's really important. If we can get more concessional funding to African governments, 22 countries are at risk of debt distress on the continent. That means that if we don't infuse them with well-priced capital, they could be quite a burden. And we're seeing countries determining whether to pay teachers or nurses or doctors or pay their debt. And we just think that's unacceptable. So on the global financial architecture, we're big on that. On health funding, we're also big on that, the replenishment. So there's Gavi replenishment ongoing, there's the Global Fund replenishment, and we believe, and these are match replenishment. So African countries come with skin in the game, and there's funding that is superimposed and partnered so that we can get our citizens immunized. So those are in the realms of what we do. In the how we do it, we do believe that we don't speak for Africa, we speak alongside with Africa. So what that means is we bring African voices in our advocacy, whether it's our young champions that we train to advocate for their continents and their countries, or it's a solidarity program with the African youth and the European youth so they can advocate in solidarity for their common future. We thought the nuance was important that European youth are not advocating for African youths. African youths and European youths are advocating on behalf of their own joint future. So that element of solidarity raises the voice and makes that agency come out. So that's this and how we do what we do, telling African success stories, because if you scanned the airways of if you do a quick Google exercise and type Africa, the stories you read will be of poverty, pestilence, and darkness. And we're saying actually that's not actually the full story. So how do we elevate success stories from Africa? Innovators, scientists that are leading the world in advancing solutions. There's a phrase that says African solutions for African problems. We don't like that. We say African solutions for global problems, because it's out of that comes out of Africa has come many solutions for the world benefit. And the last thing I'll say is where we do it. I mentioned earlier, it's really important for us to be critically aware of where the power lies and go to that space. So we do work in the G20, G7, but importantly, on Africa's terrain as well. There's the AU Summit, there's the African Climate Summit, in those areas where Africa is refining its joint voice. And Africa's superpower truly is when she can come together as 55 countries and speak with one voice, then we can push the agenda of the continent forward.
Thank you. Can you please recognize that passionate delivery? Sarah, I was going to push back on one thing until you actually landed on where I was hoping you were going, because often in the sort of development world, we go to Africa with solutions, right? And we say we're asking, what does Africa want from the world? And there isn't this reflection on the fact that actually Africa is offering a lot to the world. And when you're innovating on the continent, it isn't just for Africa, it's also globalizing Africa's solutions. And that brings agency as well. Let me go to you now, Lexia, because you work and have worked for some of the most powerful institutions in this country. And I wanted to ask, in your experience, obviously an interesting journey that you've had from an institutional perspective, what do you think are some of the strategies that international financial institutions should adopt in order to validate this idea of an Africa that is resilient, but also is self-financing?
Absolutely, thank you so much. When Ndidi calls, even 10 minutes before the panel, you show up. If I can just edit something you said earlier. If I may, before I start institutionally, given how you both have started this conversation, let me start a bit more personally. So both my parents are from Haiti, which is often considered the most African country not on the African continent. And when they were in exile from their own country, they landed in West Africa, in Togo and then in Cote d'Ivoire. So I learned how to walk in Lomé. So I have a very strong connection. I have a great uncle who spent his entire life in exile in Senegal, for example. I see Daouda is here. So this is very personal to me, and it's now jumping to your question about the institutional, it's the big driver for the work that I do, because I have seen the positive. So when a Haitian went to early independent countries in Africa to be teachers, and I meet Africans of a certain generation, and they say, oh Haiti, they remember a Haiti that was a shining promise. You look at the news today and you look at Haiti and you realize that the path is not always one directional, and so the hard work must be put in. And so I say that Africa is at the table already of the international financial system and needs to use its voice loudly. When I was in government under Obama too, I was the IDA deputy. IDA is the largest source of concessional finance in the world. And I was with the United States government then as well, and I went and met with the African representatives to IDA, and I said, could I have a meeting with you to ask you, what do you want from this replenishment? And they said it's the first time that a country had ever asked them that question. And we had robust, I will be honest with you, we had robust conversations. We agreed on a bunch of things, we disagreed on some things, but we had a real conversation as equals about what we wanted from this really important source of financing in the system. And I think we need to have more of those conversations. You mentioned President Ruto. The African Climate Summit you mentioned. The African Climate Summit for me was a foundational moment where you had a voice that was passionate, that was affirmative, that was a bringer of solutions. We are the lungs, we can be the lungs of this world, so we bring solutions for the world, and was demanding what partnership he wanted from the international system. So my first message is I think there is a very strong ability to be at the table and to use those voices. African countries are shareholders of the institutions and should be demanding not just about the portfolio and the allocation of funding for their countries, but about how the entire institution works, by the way, for their continent and others. Okay, so IDA, I mentioned, it's going to be really important to have a strong replenishment for IDA, and a replenishment that has the right level of concessionality in it because of the reasons of debt that you described. And so we need both a big IDA, but an IDA that's responsive to the different kinds of financing flows that we need. Next year, we can't forget, we also have the African Development Fund replenishment. So we have to think about that as well. We're trying to sort of think about how to innovate to create more financing in the system. And I think we've seen results by looking at institutions like the World Bank and saying, you know, are there ways that you can responsibly stretch your balance sheets? And we've seen about $200 billion, you know, in financing being made available over the next 10 years. And a good share of that will go to Africa. So I think continuing to think about how to leverage the system more powerfully is going to be really important. It also means that shareholders of the system need to think differently about how they finance the system. So for example, the United States for the first time will be providing a guarantee to the IBRD to create more space for countries. And I think that's also very important. We've worked with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a bank that focuses on the private sector, which when I meet with African leaders, they're really interested, and your point about the handshake, they're really interested in the private sector. And so this is a bank that was created after the fall of the Berlin Wall that helps countries transition to become market economies. That's exactly, I think, what I hear from African countries. And so they're starting to work in 6 countries in Africa, and I think that will be really important. The trade agenda, so trade is part of my portfolio. AGOA, AGOA, AGOA. I'll stop there, otherwise I'll get into trouble. You know, but that's you know, that's really fundamentally important. Digital, I think, is another area that we're working and thinking about a lot on the continent. I think if we when we think of basic infrastructure, absolutely energy, absolutely transport, but in my view, digital needs to be seen as part of core infrastructure. And by the way, the pace of change on digital is so fast that, you know, if you don't keep up, whatever progress you make on the other parts of infrastructure, countries are still going to be behind. And so, and by the way, we have lots of innovations on the digital side and on the technology side coming from Africa. So I think these are some of the strong priorities. I'm very excited about I'll end here. Very excited about the South African G20 presidency because I think that's a really unique moment for South Africa in partnership with other countries in the continent to shape the global agenda.
Wonderful. Please. Thank you, Alexia. You know, as you were speaking, I was asking myself, you know, I work in the development field, and we know that there is nowhere in the world where aid has developed a country. And Africa has been a poster child of aid, albeit limited and inadequate. And it continues to be what actually drives partnership with Africa in terms of where the energy of Africa's government officials go. You know, someone made a joke the other day that, it wasn't a joke actually, when rating agencies go to Africa, talked about credit rating, they don't get as much attention from government officials as they get from the IMF when the IMF team arrives, because they assume that the money is going to come from the IMF, but there isn't really an awareness that what they're losing through subjective credit rating and bias is far more than what they would get from the IMF. And I feel quite strongly that we probably overplay the hand of aid. And I'm glad that you mentioned trade as well and investment. Aid, ODA to Africa today is about 50 billion or so, and it keeps going down. Actually, it's gone down to the 40s at the best. Remittances, much more than that. But the amount of time we spend managing aid, it's like 80% of the time of Africa's officials. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned AGOA. What is your reflection on what Africa's partners need to do to make AfCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, work?
You know, I mean, I'm a big believer in the fundamentals. You know, I think you need strong macro, you need infrastructure that works. You know, those things are foundational for any any country in the world. Those things are foundational. There's no way to go around them. And so, and then you need the policy that works, right? Because it's great if you have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, but if you don't have your customs systems, fully aligned, all the what I call the soft infrastructure fully aligned, it's not going to work. And so when I think of trade, I think of export opportunities, but I think of trade, across and within the continent as well. But you've got to have the soft and the hard infrastructure that facilitates it, and you need the interest. You need the interest. I sometimes get into trouble, but I think you need the interest of country A to country B on the continent to think that country B is as interesting, if not more interesting, than the U.S. or whatever country in Europe. I mean, you actually need that too, and I think it's not an African issue. Look at the European Union. I mean, I used to work at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Commission had one voice. Well, there were lots of different voices. It's hard to build the one voice you're talking about. It's hard to build everywhere. But you're right that if you can make progress, that matters. But I think you have to get beyond the big declarations to the technical underpinnings that support the vision of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Sarah, I'm just going to come back to you. You both spoke about voice. Is voice enough? Is it that Africa's voice is not unified? We have the Africa Union, of course. Is it that it's not passionate enough? If you have voice, is that going to be what it takes? And whose voice is?
So as an advocate, it does start with voice. If nobody knows what you want, if you're not persistent, if you don't have the volume to your voice, to push on the barriers that might be, erected against you, we don't move things forward. However, we start with voice, but we don't end with voice. We end with action. So let me use the African Continental Free Trade Area that you just spoke about. That started, it was one of the elements of Africa that had the strongest political will. So it was founded in about 2018 when it was pulled up in the African Union, and by 2024, we see there have been 2 guided trade experiments to say what would it take to actually ship things within Africa. The first guided trade session, it took 6 months to ship tea from Kenya to Ghana, which was a fail. But at least we are experimenting and guiding it. So yes, there was voice in placing it as an agenda item for the African Union. And we got states to ratify, and we got, National Assembly members, parliaments to understand the urgency of this issue, where Africa is trading within itself double digits of 14%, trading with Europe 60%, trading with China even much more. But if we ended there, we'll still be talking about the African Free Trade Agreement. But today we're acting to make sure it's implemented. So it always starts with voice, volume, persistence, compelling arguments, but it never ends with voice, it ends with action.
Excellent. Do you want to comment on voice? Because
I agree.
You agree? Okay, fantastic. As we start to close, I want to ask both of you actually this question, because we started with narrative and telling the good story. And you have journeyed around the world and seen Africa from different perspectives. If you were to pick one story that has surprised you about Africa, that represents the Africa the world doesn't see, what would it be?
Do you want to go first? That's a good question. So I'll just add that narratives, we sometimes couch it in stories, but narratives actually influence policies. They influence investment attraction potential. They influence how you're seen in the global space. So narratives are much more than stories. But I think if there's a story that captures the essence of the continent, it makes me think my grandmother. So you can be sick at home and have a tummy ache and go to my grandmother and she'll say, oh, go over there to those leaves, pick that, the other, this one, mix it together, have a drink, and all of a sudden your tummy ache which I have to take Pepto-Bismol for usually, is gone. So I just know within the fabric of our continent, there's solutions that, A, we have not yet codified and have not yet exported. But one of my big moments of awakening is watching Black Panther, because there's so much there. I know it was a Hollywood movie, but there's so much there that the vibranium that, you know, Wakanda had, they just kind of kept it to themselves. It could do a lot, but they were content with the knowledge and the tools and the power within. And I think Africa has a lot of tools and knowledge and power within, expressed in the bioeconomy, that we haven't yet exported and we haven't yet codified. So that's the Africa I want the world to see.
Oh, wow. Can we clap to that, please? Alexa.
While I was listening attentively, but it also allowed me to, what flashed up to me is a dinner I had in Joburg that a friend from Guinea invited me to. And everybody at that table was someone born in Africa, by the way, a diversity of countries. All of them had done at least one of their degrees either in Europe or in the United States. And every single one of them had you know, quite fantastic jobs in a number of European or European countries or in the US. And they had all moved back to Africa. Not necessarily their country of origin, by the way, but back to the continent. And they were all entrepreneurs, building companies, some dealing with the health space, some were in the financial institution space, but they gave me such a high that night because they could succeed anywhere in the world, anywhere in the world. And they had said, you know what? The opportunities of the future are on this continent. And by the way, they succeed and talk and walk well here and at home. I can't do that. They can maneuver in different worlds super effectively, and they can drive progress super effectively. And that night gave me way much more of a high than any of the many sessions I was at this one. I was there for a conference, and really told me, you know, Secretary Yellen, when she went on an extended trip from Secretary Yellen of the Treasury Department, when she went on an extended trip to 3 countries in Africa, she said that the trajectory of the global economy is African. And that dinner makes that real, not just words.
Let me just conclude with 2 minutes, because I think this is really powerful, and I want to wrap it up with an initiative that I've just come from opening called Timbuktu, which is UNDP's, the UN Development Program's articulation of exactly what you've said, that we begin to approach Africa from a lens of opportunity rather than being in the business of misery and poverty management. And what that means with these initiatives, we're creating a platform that will capture exactly those ingredients, those solutions, homegrown solutions that the world is yet to experience. And it's coming out of our young people who are ingenious in their entrepreneurial minds. So Timbuktu is out there to find, mine, and deliver value of these entrepreneurs, of these enormously talented young Africans in the areas that will have an impact on the SDGs. 10 thematics, looking at technology-powered agriculture, health, education, creatives, and so on and so forth. So with this, I want to invite you all to go from here to Africa's future through Timbuktu. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies, for that engaging discussion. And we could go on and on. The stories were really fantastic. I love the one about your grandmother. Fabulous. Well, speaking of global financing, I'd like now to turn to ONE's Executive Director for Global Policy and Strategy, David McNair. Among David's accolades, he founded data.one.org, a dynamic platform that includes policy briefings, statistics, and data visualizations on the world's most pressing issues and the accompanying Aftershocks newsletter. And breaking news, of course I'm a news person, so I have to give you breaking news. Today, David will share the Trillions Tracker, a new product that is launching today on data.one.org that brings the financing gap to life and makes it easier than ever to follow the money on the global development and climate action. So please give a warm welcome to David.
All of us in this room have been living through an age of miracles. If we think about the trends on child, maternal mortality, and poverty, it's historical. But we know that we're facing significant headwinds. In the last 5 years, those trends have started to stagnate. And I don't need to tell you about the impacts of COVID, of Ukraine, and of the climate crisis on our mission. Things are really tough. So in the last 4 years, we and many of our partners in this room have worked to listen, reflect the needs and demands of African leaders, and channel them into the G20. Together, we helped to secure a debt service suspension initiative for vulnerable countries during COVID, a $650 billion allocation of special drawing rights, a COVID recovery package, increases in foreign assistance, and significant reforms to multilateral development banks. And these are major wins, but in the face of such bad news all the time, we only focus on the gap. So we decided to take our data-driven approach to this challenge so we know how much progress we're making, so we can evaluate new announcements based on the scale of the need, and so we can prioritize future reforms that are actually going to shift the needle. And today we're launching the Trillions Tracker. You can explore it right now. There's a card on your seat. Take a photo of the QR code or the QR code right here. But I'll just talk you through a little bit of what we're doing. So basically in 2002, independent experts led by Cameroonian economist Vera Songwe and Nick Stern from the UK estimated that we have a $2.5 trillion financing gap to fund the energy transition, to prepare for and protect from climate change, and to fund development needs like education and healthcare. This is a lot of money. $2.5 trillion bills lined up end to end would reach from Fifth Avenue to the sun and back. But it's also a similar scale to what governments today spend on military every year. So as a price tag for protecting our species, we believe it's a bargain. It would prevent millions of people from falling into poverty, avert costly humanitarian crises, minimize carbon emissions, and make the world more peaceful and prosperous. So let's get into the data. According to these estimates, governments are expected to fulfill roughly 2.2 trillion of the 2.5 trillion gap. The international community, G20 governments, multilateral development banks, the IMF, we deliver about $500 billion. And according to our new data, we've shown that gap in the last few years has closed by 29%. Finance for climate and development has increased by roughly $700 billion. So we're making progress, but different types of finance are relevant for different things. And of course, the devil is in the details. So let's get into the details. Low and middle income countries increased their domestic resources by about 416 billion, and that closed the gap by 21%. International public finance, as I said, the IMF, the World Bank, etc., increased available financing by 285 billion, closing 57% of the gap. And that breaks down into three streams. The first is official development assistance or foreign assistance, and that increased by 73.3 billion. But this estimate needs a health warning because a lot of that commitment is as a result of increases to financing to Ukraine and paying for the costs of hosting Ukrainian refugees. So actually the gap, even though it looks that it's been closed significantly, has only been closed by 24%. And since this data has been released, particularly European governments have made major cuts to their aid programs. The second stream is multilateral non-concessional lending, and that increased by 22 billion, But as a result of campaigning by one and many of our partners, we helped unlock another 185 billion from the World Bank and other multilateral development banks. So that is closing that gap by 83%. That's available money, but it still needs to be deployed. And then finally, bilateral non-concessional financing, which actually declined during that period. But because of our campaigning, particularly on IMF special drawing rights, we were able to unlock about 8 billion a year via IMF trust funds. So the message I want to leave you with is that we're in a really tough political environment. The challenges are huge, but we are making progress. And we need to keep fighting for that because progress is not inevitable. It requires people to fight for it. And all of us in this room need to continue doing so. So that's the data. Now we're going to transition to a little bit of how. How are we going to do this? And we want to talk about health replenishments, which have been a building block for progress on so many of our issues for the past 2 decades, raising over 100 billion to fight preventable disease. But the landscape is shifting. There are lots more replenishments competing for the same amount of money. The needs are increasing. So we're asking a critical question. Is the golden age of health replenishments over? And to moderate our discussion, we have someone who I'm a huge fan of, Larry Mundebo, who is an international correspondent for CNN, Bright Simons, who is founder and president of M Pedigree, and one of our stars in the One Team, Jenny Utenhoff, our senior director for policy and strategy. So please come and join us.
Thank you. He teed it up very, very nicely, so we're going to start right there. The beauty of this, it's not a panel, it's a debate. And you get to decide at the end who is most convincing. Do you like that? Yeah. So pay attention, and you will decide between Jenny and Bright who sold their argument better. Sounds good? Okay, the idea of this debate, the topic, as David said, is the golden age of health replenishments over? And the objective is we hope we can shed some light on the very complex dynamics surrounding the future of health financing, demonstrate the value of international financing institutions in advancing health outcomes, and also acknowledge that they're only part of the solution, right? And we want to demonstrate that health financing can be more responsive to health sovereignty in Africa and offer new ideas for how we shape and advance resource mobilization in the sector. So the way this works, they'll each have 3 minutes for opening statements, and then 2 minutes for rebuttals, and then 2 more minutes each for responses, and then they'll have 2 minutes for closing arguments, and then we will poll the audience. That's it. So it should be done in 15, 18 minutes tops. Are you ready? Awesome. So the audience should decide who gets to get the first opening statement between Bright and Jenny. Ladies first. Okay, all right. Smart. Jenny, you go first. 3 minutes, opening statements. So to be clear, Jenny is arguing in the negative, and Bright will be in the affirmative.
That's right.
Go for it.
All right. Everyone, think back to the year 2000. AIDS and malaria were the top cause of death in Africa, together claiming about 3 million lives a year, and most of these were young people. Everyone in this room, I think, is probably interested in global health, so probably knows what happens next. A confluence of advocacy and global attention and influx of political prioritization and financing produced nothing short of a miracle. We saw massive changes over those 20 years. AIDS-related deaths in the region dropped by 80%. Deaths from malaria in the region dropped by 40%. So what happened during that period of time to promote such change? Well, for one, development assistance for health grew 7-fold. Domestic financing for health although grew 3-fold. Not small. Volume of funding isn't the whole story. The creation of several global health financing institutions and programs changed the way funding was programmed. That's the Global Fund to Fight HIV, AIDS, TB, Malaria, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. These all started in the early 2000s, and they drove up focused investments to fight infectious disease in Africa. They also pioneered new partnerships with African governments. They shaped the market to drive down prices of vaccines and bed nets and meds for HIV and AIDS. And all of this led to more access to healthcare and fewer deaths. So if we agree that global health financing institutions are an important driver of health outcomes in Africa, then replenishments matter. Let's just look at the numbers. In 2022, 1/3 of development assistance for health to sub-Saharan Africa was channeled through institutions that rely on replenishments for resource mobilization. This goes up to over half of money for health in Africa if we take out US bilateral assistance. So replenishments are just a means to an end. There's nothing magical about them, but it is an important process for resource mobilization, and there are some unique benefits to this model compared to just annual appropriations processes. First, they allow for multi-year funding commitments. This helps improve consistency and predictability for country-led programs. They also require a level of transparency and accountability that we don't always see with other kinds of investments. And they generate political buy-in, political champions, they activate activists, they create momentum for global health year after year. So, we've established that global health financing institutions are an important driver of progress in health in Africa, and that replenishments are an effective way to mobilize resources for health for these global health financing institutions. So, is the golden era of global health replenishments over? No, it's not. A golden era is defined as just an exceptional prosperity or success or achievement. So again, I'm gonna go back to the numbers. Between 2005 and 2015, replenishments mobilized $50 billion for health. But after 2015, in the last couple of years, they've mobilized $80 billion for health. So I'm gonna argue that this is an exceptional achievement, and we are living in the golden era of global health replenishments right now. And if we care about health outcomes in Africa, which I think everyone in this room does, we better work together to ensure we remain in the era of global health replenishments. Right. Because in the next 12 months alone, at least $36 billion in health financing depends on successful replenishments. Gavi, Global Fund, Pandemic Fund, WHO, IDA. These investments matter today as much as they ever did. We must not abandon or discount a model that has worked for resource mobilization without a clear alternative.
Okay. Well argued. Bright, your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Larry. Now, let's be very clear here. All that stream of jargon and statistics, pleasing, but that is not the point. I'm not here to argue about the depth of replenishments for the global health partnerships, UNITAID, Global Fund, Gavi, et cetera, Pandemic Fund. That's not what I'm here to argue about. What I'm here to do is to announce to you that regardless of how noble these institutions are, no matter how great they've done, the fact of the matter is that they are increasingly obsolete. They are increasingly outdated, and they are not performing. I didn't kill them. I'm just here as a funeral announcer. Three very simple reasons. One, what are we really talking about here? It's about global north governments, rich countries in the global north, the OECD, being primarily responsible for financing global health. My argument that that's a problem, so that's number one. Number two, we have a situation where the amount of the financing gap or the size of the financing gap, how much we actually need to put into health that we are not putting into health, keeps expanding. So while it's true that we are mobilizing more health resources, the truth of the matter is that the global financing gap in health is not reducing, and I'll come back to that. The third point is that the countries that are eligible for these benefits from the Global Fund, from Gavi and the rest, could do more. Let's delve into the detail then. If you think of the other sides of the spectrum of development finance that we have around the World Bank, the IFC, these various other institutions, you have to ask yourself, is there some way that they figured out that allows them to put capital into other areas of importance? Education, sanitation, climate change. All of those factors that we know from a social determinants of health perspective are critical if we're going to succeed in health. Now, do they all use this replenishment model, which is entirely reliant on global north governments? No, they don't. The truth of the matter is that if you take the World Bank as an example, 94%, at least almost 94% of its capital is callable capital. What does that mean? It means that rich countries do give guarantees, but the majority of that money is mobilized in the private markets through bonds and other financing instruments. Now, in the 76-year history of that organization, there has never been a call on those guarantees. So effectively, that means the private sector funds the World Bank. And it's not just health that the World Bank does. It does education, it does sanitation, it does climate change, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the Global Fund, on the other hand, just about 5% of the funding comes from the private sector. This is strange in a world where the private sector has almost $4 trillion of money committed but not yet deployed. This is essentially idle money. This is money they can't find good access for. If we just allowed concessional lending to become a major channel through which these institutions like the Global Fund and rest mobilize money, we could potentially quadruple how much money they have to deploy.
Right.
And that is important. The second point, I know that I'm running out of time. The second point, as I've already said, is that we have a financing gap of over $175 billion. In Africa alone, it's about $65 billion. When the Global Fund does a great year, maybe it gets about 13 billion, 14 billion, 15 billion.
Right.
But that's just pledges. Think about inflation over that 3-year cycle. Think also about the fact that not all the countries that pledge actually contribute. Okay. The UK and Italy, for instance, has arrears in the last cycle. So the point I'm making is that it's not enough to close the gap. And if you actually consider all those factors, contribution and inflation considered, in actual fact, since 2008, the total level of Global Fund giving has remained stagnant.
Okay. That's a good place to end the opening statements. So, Jenny, what is your response to the funeral announcer? Can you revive health replenishments?
Yeah, so, you can argue that the norms that have shaped global health financing are dead or are out of date, perhaps. A lot has changed in the last 20 years since a lot of these financing institutions and thus the rise of replenishments happened. Different global threats, geopolitics, epidemiology has changed, and the way we address diseases has changed. But if the old order is out of date, there is not yet a clear successor. You have outlined some potential, and I think we need to lean into all of those options. But transitioning from one paradigm to the next without backsliding progress is not going to happen overnight. So, especially with 1 in 3 people living in countries that spend more on debt service than health, which you just spoke to. So let's not present this as a binary option. We need both and approach to health financing. We need a fully funded global health financing institutions and more fiscal space for health in countries. We need successful health replenishments and lower cost of capital to increase social sector spending in Africa. Too often these arguments are reduced or pegged to a zero-sum game, and that does have to stop, and we do need to spend a lot more time, research, and effort pushing other channels for financing.
Okay, good. So she thinks you're backsliding progress by completely turning this model on its head. See what I'm doing here? I'm just kind of sticking them on each other. Go for it.
So the truth is that we've got the global level, we've got a domestic level, we've got institutions in between that try to, make this system work. If you think of Gavi, for instance, and you look at some of the countries that are eligible for this financing, you have the likes of Bolivia, you have the likes of Angola, you have the likes of Venezuela, you have the likes of Indonesia. Now, my argument is that these countries don't need just a mechanism that relies on replenishment to make much of a difference. I'll give you an example. In 2014, Vietnam's entire spending on vaccination was less than $80 million. Total healthcare expenditure in Vietnam was in excess of $17 billion. In essence, 0.5% of immunization in Vietnam, 0.5% of total healthcare expenditure goes to immunization in Vietnam. What is Gavi going to do for a country like that? And yet it was an eligible country. And there are many examples I can give. India, Russia, what are they doing on these lists? They are giving aid in Africa. And they are, in some instances, they are lending money in Africa for interest. When I say that if they really need that money, they should borrow it in the open markets. There's absolutely nothing you can say that can convince anyone just looking at the hard, cold numbers that these countries cannot step up and step up more. It's just pure, unadulterated facts.
Pure, unadulterated facts. The facts that he's spitting right here. Okay, closing statements.
All right.
We got 4 minutes to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on this. All right.
Jenny.
I acknowledge there has been a proliferation of replenishments over the last several years. There are 12, I think. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 7 replenishments in the next 12 months. This is no doubt contributing to donor fatigue and advocate fatigue. But I think that we need to be really careful that replenishment fatigue should not become a scapegoat for donor fatigue or for government financing for health. Political prioritization for global health needs to increase at every single level, and yes, among countries. We can't rationalize a zero-sum game any longer, year after year after year. We're talking about the health and well-being of the youngest and fastest-growing population on the planet, and we shouldn't undermine the potential of this human capital for the continent of Africa, for the world, with such a narrow and limited vision for global health financing. So again, I'm not here to defend just replenishments. I'm here to defend global health financing at every level, and we need more of it. To date, the replenishment model has worked to some degree, but successful replenishments alone are not the goal. Healthy people are. So at any point, if the model is not working, we need to be prepared to pivot, and we need to crowd in other resources from other places and double down.
So
Okay. And your closing statement, Bright.
Indeed, I have one. I think what Jenny has done is move to my side of the fence, which makes me very uncomfortable. It's very difficult. But the truth of the matter is that we're here to ask the question, is the golden age of replenishments over? I've tried to explain to you that a model that is heavily reliant, 95% on rich country governments, in a world that is dramatically transforming, in a world in which the global north countries are no longer the epicenter, the center of gravity of global economies, et cetera, is simply outdated. We have to have a system that recognizes the reality of the new economy. That is just the mere fact. So that's my point one. My point two was that the global financing gap is not being closed. If these guys are doing so amazing, the Global Fund, Gavi, and the rest are doing so amazing, why is the gap not closing? Clearly there's something wrong there. And my third point was that there are countries on that eligibility list that can do better. Russia, India, Indonesia, Bolivia. When you hear those names, does that sound like a group of countries that need some money from Geneva before they prevent their infants from dying? I say no.
Okay, that is a great place to end the debate. Stay with me. It is time for the audience to decide who won the debate. Let me explain the rules. You are judging them based on these three criteria, okay? This is the marking scheme. 1, clarity and strength of the arguments presented. 2, how well each speaker responded to the opposition's points. And 3, and equally important, the use of evidence and examples in supporting their arguments. Okay, you ready? All right. How many of you think that Jenny convinced you and won the debate? And how many of you think that Bright convinced you and won the debate? Okay, just to be sure, it feels like it could be an African election. So, just to be sure, I've covered enough of them. I've seen this happen. One more time, convincingly. Jenny won the debate. Raise your hand, hoot and holler. And Bright won the debate. Let's hear it. It is clear Bright won the debate. You had a better argument. Congratulations. Well debated. Good job. That was a fantastic conversation, right? All right. Back to you.
Wow, you guys are both brave. That's impressive. That takes me back to school days. Wow. I think it was a tie, actually. But yeah, right, you think so too. Thank you, Jenny, Bright, and Larry. That was really, really a lot of fun. Well, our next panelist will be here shortly, but in the meantime, as we celebrate this 20th anniversary of ONE, I think it might be a good time for us to take a look at this great organization and all the work that has been done. So please take a look at your screens.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry we're being subjected to a little UNGA traffic delays, as I'm sure you are all very familiar with. But we are going to go ahead and get started with our last panel. Excuse me. If you can please come on stage and introduce yourself. And I do believe we also have Nisha Biswal, who will be coming on stage. Thank you. And Dr. Kaseya is stuck in traffic, and unfortunately, Gargi Ghosh had to send her regards. But thank you all so much for your patience, and you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for bearing with us. We're going to make a start, and we may have some panelists that join us, but in the meantime, Nisha and I and myself are very delighted to have this conversation. And I will suggest as well, please feel free as an audience if you have some questions or if you have some comments that we can take those. So let me briefly start by introducing myself. I'm Jean-Paul Adam, and I'm the Director for Policy, Monitoring and Advocacy in the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa to the United Nations Secretary General. We have very long titles in the UN. Previously, I served in various ministerial roles in Seychelles, including as Minister of Health. So this subject is very close to my heart, and it's critical for the future of development for us to address this issue, particularly in Africa. So we're talking about the future of global health financing, and we were fascinated by the debate that just preceded us. But in this conversation, we want to talk about how do we reframe the future of health financing and sharing some ideas on potential solutions. We are conscious that a lot has been achieved through the replenishments of all these funds that have made a huge difference, whether it be the Global Fund, whether it be Gavi. They have all contributed towards the development story and improving the lives of millions of people. But one of the missing links remains the continuation in sustainability, particularly in the context of very difficult fiscal environments for African countries and other emerging economies. In Africa, in particular, in 2023 and 2024, African countries, African governments are spending twice in terms of debt servicing than what they are able to invest in government expenditure on healthcare. So that's a stark reminder of what's at stake. And we are also seeing that, therefore, some of the positive developments are at risk. And one of the key challenges is how do we address financing the future, building on the existing models around the funds, but also building the architecture and platforms within countries so we can have sustainable funding in the long term. So I will immediately go to Nisha to start us off, to get your sense of where we are, first of all, what are the bottlenecks, what are the challenges that you are aware of in terms of health financing, and how do we reframe this conversation?
Well, thank you so much, and great that I get to filibuster up here for a little while until our fellow panelists show up. But let me just say, the conversation around UNGA this year and last year really has been about the fact that we're in this era of polycrises, and we're seeing that not only is there not sufficient funding to address all of these myriad crises that we're seeing around the world, but countries are falling further behind on meeting their SDG targets, right? Because that public financing is simply not sufficient. And so the conversation has increasingly been about, how do we mobilize private capital to help support these goals and these targets. And, that is true when you think about humanitarian crises. That is true when you think about kind of the big needs to mobilize financing for economic growth, for infrastructure. And it is certainly true when you think about financing in the health sector, right? And so, yes, we need the replenishments. Yes, we need the public financing to continue, but we can't rely on that as being the sole driver. We need to also be able to mobilize new sources of financing. We need to be able to partner with the private sector. We need to be able to partner with local institutions and draw upon the capital, here in Africa, whether it's working with, African Finance Corporation or working with African Development Bank and others. And so it really is an all-of-the-above solution that is necessary, and that's really what I think DFC is focused on as well.
No, thank you so much. And I apologize, I forgot to mention that Nisha is the Deputy CEO of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, but I think everyone knew that, right? I mean, she's a trailblazer and well-known in this field. But thanks so much for those elements, Nisha. Maybe I could just ask, in the developing world, particularly in low-income countries, in continents like Africa, what does this partnership, for example, with the private sector look like? How can we deliver that in these environments?
That's a great question. And look, I will talk a little bit maybe about trip I had earlier this year to Sierra Leone. And the fact that, when we think about investing in health systems, we can't really think about it in a very narrow or siloed approach. In countries where there is a higher level of fragility and where we really need to think about a more holistic approach to investing and a more holistic approach to strengthening. And the reason I say this is I was there for a groundbreaking with President Bio and his team on a power plant that DFC is helping to finance in Sierra Leone. And the First Lady of Sierra Leone spoke at that groundbreaking, and what she talked about, actually, was how investing in this power plant was going to be a game changer for health systems in Sierra Leone. That she was focused on this because the hospitals in Sierra Leone did not have the stable power supply, so that when we have, premature babies and there's not the generator capacity and the stable power to keep the incubators functioning, and that has increased the child mortality. So she was linking the, provision of stable power to health outcomes in the country. And, as we think about how we're investing and how we're partnering across the continent on advancing health outcomes, we have to think about it a bit more holistically, right? Now, at DFC, we've mobilized, we've committed over $3 billion in the last 4 years, specifically for health projects across Africa. Over 50 projects working with the private sector in everything from supporting vaccine manufacturing capacity, looking at things like medical oxygen production, to partnering with key institutions like Gavi, thinking about how do we prevent or how do we prepare for the next pandemic? What are the areas of investment that are going to allow us to have quicker responses, be better positioned across the continent to address the next crisis, which frankly is unfolding as we speak with the impacts crisis.
No, thanks so much. I think you've brought in a very important aspect of the development of the healthcare sector in Africa, and that's the accompanying infrastructure, the enabling environment which is linked to that infrastructure, such as energy, which is absolutely critical, but also the other parts of the health value chain, local manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, of vaccines. These are absolutely critical, and I know that African Union heads of state have emphasized their desire to develop that. And maybe before I'm going to ask the audience, I want to hear a little bit from some of the thinkers here, because I know I'm recognizing a few people that have a lot of expertise to share here. I'd like to hear from the audience what you think are the biggest barriers that African countries or developing countries currently face in terms of health financing. And it'll be good to hear people's thoughts. But I'll go to you first, Nisha.
I wanted to actually make a point drawing upon the debate that preceded this conversation, and Bright Simon was talking about the fact that when you start to see, the investment coming in from India and from Russia, that's when you start to say, okay, now we're getting the game changing. Well, I was in India 2 weeks ago, and I did a roundtable with India's Confederation of Indian Industries with their kind of industry chamber. And the conversation that I was having with them was actually exactly that, which was that, it's not sufficient to look at the African market as your export market. You really need to be thinking about how you're investing in production capacity in Africa across all sectors. And in fact, talking to some of the Indian pharmaceutical companies about, what are you doing to put production capacity in Africa? So I think that is a conversation that is happening. And this is where we said, we're willing to bring our balance sheet and our, tools to bear to help facilitate that investment so that we can support, we can de-risk the investment if you feel like, you don't have sufficient guarantee on the return on that investment. We have patient capital that we can provide. If you're worried about currency fluctuation, if you're worried about political stability or instability, we have political risk insurance, that we can bring the tools that are necessary to really facilitate more private investment in the health sector in Africa. And that's what we're very committed to doing.
No, fantastic points. And I think that we need those vehicles that DFC and others like you provide to accompany that private sector element, which will help. But I'd like to go back to one of the core issues which also came from the previous debate. And if we're talking a little bit about Africa's health sovereignty, the challenge of financing these health systems remain. The private sector will certainly bring part of the solution, but we also need to think about the sustainable financing in the medium to longer term. And are there any ideas? I think there are some very interesting examples I'll cite perhaps Rwanda, that has worked on health insurance models, which have been very successful in community-based. I think they have reached 90% coverage, if I'm not mistaken, according to the latest figures, which is remarkable. But and that's an insurance model, so it's aimed at developing contributions from the population, but also supported by the government. And critically, the idea is therefore to build a system which is not just dependent on funds. In the interim, we do need the support of these global funds, as we already heard. But how do we do it in a way whereby we have more security in terms of that financing? Because we really sense that risk from the previous discussion. And how do we build that health sovereignty? Any thoughts? If anyone would like to make a contribution, please raise your hands. I see a gentleman in the back there. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm T. Arthur Chibwana. I work for ID Insight. I am from Malawi. I just want to bring an African perspective from the ground. When I look at the title, we're talking about Africa at the forefront of global financing solutions. And we have interesting buzzwords as well. We're talking about health sovereignty. We're talking about sustainability. But looking at the conversation so far, there is a focus on moving money from the north to Africa. Where is Africa in this puzzle? That's one of the things that is actually causing me to worry about sustainability. So we are basically encouraging dependency. I have done some work on health financing in my country, and I remember engaging the government and parliament as well, Parliamentary Committee on Health, looking at the structure of our budget. It's sad because only 9.5% of the national budget is allocated for health. And that's very sad because health is everything. And then on top of that, when you look at how spending is happening, you realize that over 60% is coming from the top guns. From the previous debate, I was hearing Gavi and others. That will not sustain anything. Yes, we can move capital, more money from the north to African countries. But we need to ensure that Africans are owning this process. Let me be a bad messenger. I haven't heard, apart from maybe the first debate, I haven't seen a conversation that is led by someone from the ground talking about their experiences. We have successful experiences. We've seen successes in areas like Rwanda. You just mentioned that, where communities are owning their own healthcare, their community contributions. But when you look at how much countries are doing, you see that there's little emphasis on what the communities can actually do to build it from the ground up, and then having capital from the north supporting strengthening systems. But we need to deal with the dependency a lot more, because if we create a situation where money has to flow from developed countries to developing countries, then all these challenges that we're dealing with will not go anywhere. So if you ask me about sustainability, I think we need to deal with the root. The root, money alone will not solve all these things. But we need to make sure that we have the right systems on the ground, but also Africans are owning their health process. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Nisha.
I think that's a profound statement, and one that I, fundamentally agree with. Let me make a couple of points to just come back on some of the points that you made. One of the things that we are doing is not only de-risking capital coming in from Europe and the United States and Asia, but we're also de-risking African capital to invest in Africa. How does that happen? We provide portfolio loan guarantees and loans to African banks for them to be able to support on lending to consumers that perhaps otherwise would be deemed too risky to receive that capital, right? And that is trying to get more capital in circulation in Africa from African sources by providing guarantees, by providing some support, or loans, and then we're co-investing alongside African institutions. So whether that's the African Finance Corporation, whether that's African Development Bank. But to your larger point, this morning I participated in a steering committee meeting with President Ruto on the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative. And really the conversation there was about the fact that as the world moves towards an energy transition, there is opportunity here for Africa, for African countries to play a driving role. But also in supporting global energy transition, but also in that process to build sustainable economic growth in Africa, to invest in the infrastructure and the industrialization in this country in a sustainable way. And how do you mobilize capital from within Africa and also leverage capital from outside Africa to build that economic infrastructure that is going to then allow the self-reliance and reduce the focus or the need for donor-funded systems, right? So I think that it's a process, and it's something where there is much more attention and focus given right now about how do we do this in a more holistic way? How do we take a more of an ecosystem approach?
Thank you so much. And we do have to be conscious of time before concluding, but we'd like to also hear from one of our guests who I think has some very interesting thoughts to share with us.
Thank you very much. My name is Amadou Hott. Until recently, I was the special envoy of the president of AFDB for the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, but I was a Minister of Economy.
Yes, I wasn't sure which title to use to introduce.
Exactly, exactly. Now I'm just using former stuff, you know. Yes. So I had to resign to focus on my candidacy for the presidency of the African Development Bank next year. So thank you very much. I was asked I was coming in to maybe give some remarks on this very important issue. And actually yesterday, Michael Bloomberg chaired a committee with Prime Minister Motley on fiscal health, how to raise money to basically, make sure that people stop using tobacco, beverages that have too much sugar, so that we can save 100 million lives basically in total a year, people dying because of those things. One of the points that I made as a member of the task force was that we could use the proceeds of those tax for tobacco and all of that to make sure that ministers of finance increase the health budget. Because ministers of finance mostly see health investment and budget as a kind of burden, not immediately seeing the economic impact of people not being healthy and all of that. And using that tax could really help finance healthcare, but also provide communities that are really disadvantaged, provide them with medical insurance that is needed. Because most of the time in our countries, people who are working in government or private sector have salaries. They tend to have medical insurance. But those who are in the informal sector or who are out of jobs tends to not have medical insurance. So one can use that to strengthen basically that space and provide everyone with medical health insurance. And then lastly, financing actually healthcare shouldn't be just done by the governments. There are some structures that you can have where you can have PPPs where the private sector can get involved, not just to avoid the government to borrow, but also for the efficiency of managing hospitals, of managing centers. If you have the private sector managing it in a very transparent way, that can really save a lot to governments. And lastly, use digital infrastructure. In most countries, you go to a hospital, you provide your details and everything, you do a lot of diagnostic and everything, and then 6 months later, you are sick, then that information is lost, or 3 months later, you have to redo it. So digitalizing is also very important, but governments need to have the political will to resist the lobbies in the healthcare system. Because doctors, nurses, I'm not sure that you have many of them here in the room, but the lobby is strong, the unions are strong, and people resist basically reforms and resist the transparency and resist to using digitalization. Countries try, but people tend to not implement. So you need to have strong political will, strong leadership to make sure that those reforms are done. One example, in Senegal, when I was the CEO of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, we did the first PPP with a public hospital where we took over all the diagnostic activities and run it as a private enterprise. We signed a PPP contract over 10 years where we bought the scanners, all the equipment that you need, and we secured maintenance contract for 5 years where we have no problems of availability. Whereas the public hospitals, maybe you have 30% availability, but in our business model, we had 97% availability. And that project, the government said, let's replicate in all the hospitals in the country. We tried hard for like 2 years. We could not make it. And until now, we could not do it because of the strong unions also in that system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amadou. An excellent intervention, and I can speak from my own experience also as health minister. The taxes on not only on cigarettes but on alcohol, and increasingly we're seeing African countries deploying sugar taxes, for example. And all of these areas simultaneously help to address the rise of non-communicable diseases while also raising very important revenues for investment in health systems. And just to link it with the previous point from the excellent point made from the colleague from Malawi, for these investments to work, we do need, however, strong guidance from the government. A lot more can be done by the private sector. You can develop insurance systems, but we do need governments to set the frameworks. And that requires a lot of policy support at the level of governments, and it also requires a basic availability of financing. And I think we have to recognize, and one of the key takeaways perhaps for us to have in this session is not only having the financing from the funds, but how we can leverage those funds and that financing to also deliver on health systems development. So it becomes an anchor for then the mobilization of additional funds. We are actually at the end of time, but I will ask if Nisha is willing to get her final thoughts on some of the solutions. And, Jean is here. So, Jean.
Sorry, guys, bear with us. It's Onga Week.
Bienvenue.
Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaseya, who runs Africa CDC.
A nice experience walking, driving,
The walking is to keep you healthy as well. So, Jean, do I have the permission to go over time? Yes, thank you. So, Jean, welcome.
Thank you.
And we're very pleased to have you with us. Because we nonetheless have some other events, so I would ask you to come in simultaneously to talk a little bit about some of the constraints that we face in Africa in terms of health financing, particularly, and you may wish to speak to some of your experience in Africa CDC, working with some of these, some of the global funds, how they have helped you, but also looking ahead to some of the solutions to build Africa's health sovereignty, how we can deliver a more predictable model for financing, which is also anchored within the capacity of individual countries.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry again for being late. We saw with Global Fund, Gavi, and 7 years ago, CEPI, a huge progress made in Africa for access to vaccines and some therapeutics and diagnostics. That one supported us even to, increase the coverage of some of our interventions in Africa. But you will see, due to a number of constraints that we are facing with traditional donors, in many countries, people are saying, we want you to focus more on what's happening domestically, internally in our countries. Second, we want you to tell us more about what is the impact of what you are making linked to our national security. And all of these discussions are making things so complicated. I think let us talk about what is public. You saw the debate about PEPFAR, the reauthorization of PEPFAR. But you don't know how people were anxious in Africa because PEPFAR is 30% of Global Fund, but also directly supporting many countries. And we are facing these challenges, so many challenges. But we don't have to sit just with these challenges. We need to think how we can overcome these challenges. There are a number of areas we are considering. The first one, yes, we need to increase our domestic resources. And with that, in Africa, we have President Kagame, who is the champion for domestic resources. And even we are planning a summit by December this year to see how we can bring all of our leaders together to provide more funding. The second one is let us avoid wastage of resources and duplication. This is why we are calling for what we call the Lusaka agenda. And even this morning, I had a nice meeting with all USG principals to discuss about how we can open our books to say exactly how much US they are contributing in each area, and for us to know how we can complement with other resources. That one will help us to avoid the wasted. The third one is to think about some innovative financing mechanism. And you know, when I was elected, I was thinking about this airline tax. We are still working on that. But more important, we are putting in place a high-level innovative committee. We have some brilliant people in Africa. They were ministers of finance. They were leading a number of areas. Even I was thinking to bring Didi there and to see how they can help us to craft some ideas on this innovative financing that we can bring. Because we have the private sector. After here, I will be with Tony Elumelu. It will be a question. Tony, how are you contributing in the health sector in Africa? Because we don't want just to go to Bill Gates. We want also to go to African philanthropies. You see, a number of ideas that we can have. And I think we are moving towards a smart way to manage some resources that we have and to have additional resources for our health sector. If we don't do that, we'll be in trouble. Then I will start now to talk about DFC. I see, I see also Nafisa who's sitting there. And we need to leverage on all of these mechanisms that exist for like pandemic, preparedness bond, you know, everything called bond. We can think about it and say how we can tap into this mechanism to bring more resources. Lastly, what I'm saying to our head of state, we need to stop with the communist mentality. We need to embrace the business acumen. And we need to know that sometimes we need to go to market to bring more money, to invest this money, and to pay our loan, because mostly health sector in Africa is considered like a liability, not an asset. But health sector can become also an asset, like with local manufacturing. Let me stop there. I took my 3 minutes that were given to me. I stop. Thank you.
Perfect. Nisha, any final thoughts on the solutions? I'm conscious now that we have to wrap up, so we could be quite succinct, but what's the key thing that we need to do that we are not doing?
Well, I think what we are starting to do more and more is the partnerships, right? Deep and meaningful partnerships. We work very closely with Dr. Kaseya as we are looking at, things like, you talked about health sovereignty, vaccine sovereignty, and how do we support manufacturing of vaccines? How do we ensure that we're taking our cue from the priorities that African governments and African institutions are identifying, and that's what at DFC that we're trying to do in the conversation yesterday on the medical countermeasures, where we announced surge financing mechanisms, really is to make sure that the next time that there is a health emergency, that health institutions are able to call forward the financing that is necessary to create the rapid response. So that partnership and that innovation is really right now the hallmark of how we're approaching this.
Fantastic. And I would really like to thank both of the panelists, and apologies that we are concluding. Allow me to just mention a few key messages for the takeaway, and I will frame them also in the context of Africa's demographic dividend. The future of Africa is linked to this fantastic opportunity around the large number of young people. And this is also a global opportunity, because a lot of global growth will depend on how well Africa can grow. And this is where health systems become essential, because that demographic dividend is only realized if there is predictable investment in health systems. And a few of the key things we've heard. Firstly, because of the challenges that we face now, the debt overhang that African countries face, the lack of fiscal space, the funds are continuing to be extremely important. We need that financing to be there now. We want to create more health sovereignty, domestic capacity, but we need to make sure that partners are continuing to put money into these funds because they are life-saving, literally. We need this as an urgency. Secondly, we need that health sovereignty. We need to develop that capacity within African countries. It's linked to the policy the policies in place that allow us to build along the lines of what Rwanda has done to meet that goal of universal health coverage for African countries. And it also means tapping into additional forms of finance. That includes strong engagement with the private sector. It means also looking at instruments such as bonds, engaging with partners so we can bring all these flows of finance into this critical sector, which is a multiplier. It involves using taxation and digital tools to be more efficient. In terms of taxation, again, taxing in a way that is not just hitting the poorest, but focusing on those that are dealing with non-communicable diseases, such as those on alcohol, on cigarettes, on sugar, allowing these funds to be reinvested in these health systems. And it's not one prioritized over the other. All of these need to be happening simultaneously. Thank you to everyone for listening to us and facilitating our discussion. I think the previous debate was very helpful to us. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, Jean, Amadou, and to everyone who has contributed. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience members for these insights and for your emphasis on how we need to break away from silos, work holistically, and ensure no one is left behind. Good evening, everyone. My name is Anushka. I am a current ambassador for One Campaign UK and a former intern with One Campaign Canada. More than half of the world's population still lacks access to essential healthcare services, and more than 100 million people are pushed into extreme poverty every year because of how these out-of-pocket healthcare services are expensive. This is a global crisis, and it demands for us to not just talk, but take immediate action and financing. For me, this issue is deeply personal. Why, you ask? I lost my father to a global health emergency, the COVID-19 pandemic. It was at a time when the healthcare machinery in India was so overburdened, we couldn't even find an oxygen cylinder for him. It was a moment that sparked a fire in me, but also shattered my whole world. But I decided to take this as a fuel to my fire to keep on taking action. It's when I continued on my journey to serve as an activist, reaching over 100,000 young people in my community through grassroots level advocacy, and now as an intern at One Canada and a One UK ambassador, I am fighting for the rights of those who are often forgotten. As ambassadors, we not only lobby the Parliament in Ottawa, but we also send handwritten letters to the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, co-created the first ever global activist program for young change makers in Canada, and also took over the Yonge and Dundas Square in Toronto, as well as led the Canadian government to signing a $1.2 billion pledge for the Global Fund that year for the next 3 years. And now in the UK, we're actively getting trained to ensure that our MPs know that we're not the leaders of tomorrow, we're leaders of today, and we can take action now, and we have the power to do so. One exists, and we, the ambassadors, exist because we deeply care to create a more just and equal world for all. It's not just my personal fight, it's all of ours. It's what our future depends on. We must demand that governments and organizations prioritize health financing. Imagine what we could achieve if we truly invested in healthcare. Millions of lives saved, millions lifted out of poverty. So I urge you all to take action with me. Together, we can change this, and I believe in you. So we need to ensure that no one loses their loved ones, just like I did, and so many others. And together, we can ensure that everyone, everywhere, has a life of dignity, poverty, and equal opportunity. Thank you so much.
I think it was so powerful to end with a young voice because our continent is overwhelmingly young. And to have an Indian, Canadian, British fighting for Africa. It just shows you how global this world is. So thank you again to our panelists. Please join them on stage for a picture. The generation belongs to you. Tom, join on stage for a picture. This is our board chair, Tom Preston. He'll join us on stage for a picture. Jamie Drummond, please. Yes. Join us on stage for a picture. And I want to thank our audience. Outside is a reception. People have already started having fun. That's why there's so much noise outside and not inside. And for those who stayed behind, you guys are the real intellectual, brilliant ones, while the others just want to party. All right, come closer.
Can you all get real tight for us, please? Okay, go to Chris first, please.
All right, everyone look at me.
Eyes right to me, please. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Please go have fun, mingle, network, and act. God bless you all.